Today we're diving into a pivotal moment in church history, the Canons of Dort. These canons weren't just some dusty old document, they were instrumental in saving the Reformation, as Dr. Godfrey puts it. We'll explore the pastoral heart of these canons and how they shaped the Reformed tradition. Why should we care about something that happened over 400 years ago? Well, the Canons of Dort address timeless truths that still resonate with the church today. By understanding this historical event, we gain crucial insights into our own theological foundations and the ongoing struggle to faithfully follow Christ. Think of the major turning points in church history. You have the Council of Nicaea in 325 AD, which solidified the understanding of Jesus' divinity. Then much later, the Council of Trent in the mid-1500s, which formalized the Roman Catholic Church's rejection of the Reformation. In that same league of importance is the Synod of Dort, the assembly that safeguarded the Reformation's legacy for Calvinistic churches. The Christian faith has always faced challenges. From the very beginning, there have been those who sought to distort the gospel. The Synod of Dort stands in that long line of defenders, like Jesus confronting the Pharisees, Paul resisting the Judaizers, and Augustine combating Pelagius. Dort was a stand against the errors of Arminianism, continuing the fight for truth. Here, the Synod of Dort occurred at a critical juncture. The world was on the brink of the Enlightenment, a period that would elevate human reason and downplay human depravity. Dort's affirmation of God's sovereignty and grace served as a vital counterpoint to the rising tide of human-centered thinking. We'll come full circle by the end of this presentation. The theological battles fought at Dort are still relevant. By understanding the issues at stake, then, we can better grasp the challenges and opportunities facing the church now. Let's take a few minutes and listen to Dr. Godfrey as he describes the importance of history and of this topic of the Synod of Dort.
Of Calvinism, and over the last decade plus, there's been a great resurgence in new Calvinism, renewed interest in the 5 points of Calvinism. How is it that we've got to this point where people can know the 5 solas of the Reformation, the 5 points of Calvinism, but as we kind of hinted at earlier, a lot of people don't realize the origin of those 5 points. They don't know they came from the Synod of Dort and their response to the Remonstrants. How have we come to this place where our knowledge of church history is so lacking?
This probably reflects that not enough people have bought the Ligonier series on church history, available. Was that bad?
At ligonier.org, yeah.
Available at ligonier.org. The state of the American church is a pretty ahistorical state. I mean, Americans, have always followed that great philosopher, Henry Ford, who said history is bunk. Americans by nature have been forward-looking, not backward-looking. So history has never been our strong suit as Americans, and then that very much affects the character and state and interests of the church as well. The crucial thing, of course, is not really to know about the Synod of Dort just as a tidbit of history, but the value of knowing about the Synod of Dort is it really was the greatest Reformed ecclesiastical gathering everywhere, anywhere. What's the word I want? At any time, in any place. And so it really is an event worth remembering. These folks went to this relatively small Dutch town that had the name Dordrecht, that we abbreviate in English as Dort, and they met there for 6.5 months and worked to produce a clear statement of Calvinist theology. And we call it the 5 points of Calvinism. I don't think they would have called it that because Calvinism doesn't have 5 points. This is an argument I make in the book, as you well remember.
I'm so glad I did read the book.
Yes. Arminianism has 5 points. It was Arminianism that reduced the discussion and the debate to 5 points. And the Synod of Dort responds to the 5 points of Arminianism, or more accurately, the 5 errors of Arminianism. So really what the Synod of Dort would say it did was to provide biblical answers to the 5 errors of Arminianism. So we should be careful about that, because Calvinism is not summarized in 5 points, which could be implied when we talk about the 5 points of Calvinism. If you want a summary of Calvinism, you should read the Westminster Confession or the Heidelberg Catechism or the Belgic Confession. These are the summaries of Calvinism as a whole. And what Dort did was to respond to particular errors that were challenging Calvinism.
Let's set the stage. Our story begins with Jacobus Arminius, a theologian whose ideas sparked the controversy leading to the Synod of Dort. A quick overview of the historical context will help us appreciate the significance of the canons. This document was a plea to the civil authorities for tolerance of their views within the Church. It's a key document because it outlines the core tenets of Arminian theology. We need to be clear about those who sided with Arminius were called Remonstrants or Arminians. Those defending the Reformed faith were known as Counter-Remonstrants or Calvinists. The Remonstrants of 1610 laid out 5 key points of Arminian theology. In response, the Counter-Remonstrants clarified their own position, which eventually became known as the 5 points of Calvinism. But remember, Calvinism is much more than just these 5 points. History is always written from a perspective. It's crucial to remember that even those who oppose the truth can influence how events are interpreted. We need to be discerning and critical thinkers. The 5 points are a helpful response to Arminianism, but they don't encompass the fullness of Calvinism. Calvinism finds its complete expression in the confessions, like the Heidelberg Catechism and the Westminster Confession of Faith. And so the stage is set for the Synod of Dort, convening on November 13th, 1618 in the city of Dordrecht. This gathering of theologians and church leaders would grapple with the Arminian controversy and seek to uphold the Reformed faith. The Synod wasn't just a church affair. It had the backing of the civil government. This highlights the close relationship between church and state in that era. The Arminians weren't exactly thrilled about the Synod. They feared it would be biased against them. To ensure fairness, the organizers invited Reformed leaders from all over Europe to participate. The selection process for delegates varied depending on whether a region had a Reformed government or not. This ensured representation from a wide range of Reformed churches. In total, 82 delegates from 19 delegations gathered at Dort. The majority were from the Netherlands, but a significant number came from other European countries. The Arminians arrived at the Synod ready to defend their views. This marked the beginning of intense theological debate and scrutiny. One memorable moment was the marathon opening speech by Simon Episcopius, the leader of the Arminian delegation. Let's just say it was a bit long-winded. Things got heated at times. During a debate on election, Gomarus and Martinius nearly ended up in a duel. Thankfully, cooler heads prevailed. After weeks of discussion, the Synod's president, Johannes Bogerman, lost patience with the Arminians and dismissed them from the sessions. They were told to submit their arguments in writing instead. With the Arminians gone, the Synod carefully examined their written statements to fully understand and assess their theological positions. The decisions made at Dort have had a lasting impact on the Church. To understand the theological landscape today, we need to look back at what happened then. Now, let's bring things back to the present. It might surprise you, but much of the Church today leans towards Arminianism. This is a concerning trend because, as we've seen, Arminianism deviates from the biblical truths affirmed at Dort. Even back then, people debated the severity of the Arminian error. William Ames, a key figure at the Synod of Dort, called it a serious error tending to heresy. This means it's not something to be taken lightly. We'll now close with a few more minutes of Dr. Godfrey talking about the importance of these doctrines and the impact on their neglect or rejection.
You've mentioned already that there were false accusations made against the reformers and those that believed in Reformed theology, stereotype, straw man kind of argumentation. And you note that it is not to say too much to say that if predestination is not a comfort to the people of God, that it has not been rightly understood or taught. Help us understand, how should we think about predestination? What is the non-strawman view of the Calvinists' sovereign God?
Well, there's several ways to approach that. One would be just to sit down and read Ephesians chapter 1. Because the remarkable thing about Ephesians chapter 1 is the way that Paul celebrates predestination as the solution to problems, not the source of problems. Paul's not embarrassed to talk about predestination. He praises God for it because it celebrates God's effective plan to save a people, which he carries out. And Paul thinks this is wonderful. We should all think it's wonderful. And if we don't see that as wonderful, we need to go back to the drawing board because we're not really understanding it. Predestination does not stand over us as a mystery in the mind of God that threatens us. It's the doctrine that assures us that the God who brings us to faith, gives us grace, will preserve us to the end, and he's brought us to faith, he's brought us to grace according to his eternal plan. So from everlasting to everlasting, the glory is God's, the work is God's, and the comfort and encouragement then is ours. Now the canons in the first head of doctrine, which is on predestination, approaches this question also in a slightly different but very helpful way. It begins not in eternity, thinking about the decrees of God, but it begins in history with the human condition. So Article 1 of the first head of doctrine says that we're all dead in trespasses and sins. Well, let that sink in a minute. How can dead people help themselves? Dead people cannot help themselves. So God has to help them. And how does he help them? Well, he sends, it's very interesting what the canons say next. God sends his Son to save them. And then God in his mercy sends preachers to tell them about his Son. And then God sends the Holy Spirit to bring the elect to faith. So starting with the human problem and condition, and then talking about God's gospel preservation, and then answer the question, why do some believe and some don't? You know, that's a good question. Here we can have a pretty high level of confidence that we're all believers. We didn't go to dinner to miss this session. We're here. So this is, was that bad? Yeah. So here we are, a group of believers. And if I say to you, why do you believe and some do not? There's really only two answers. We may fudge it, but there's really only two answers. Either we believe because we're better than the people who don't. We're wiser, we're smarter, we're more moral, we take the right decision, we're better people. Or we believe because God gave us the gift. We're not better. We're not more moral. We're not more wise. And I think Dort develops that idea really rather brilliantly.